So it's my pleasure today to introduce a colleague and old friend, Dr. Robert Waldinger. Dr. Waldinger received his AB degree summa cum laude from Harvard and also received his MD degree from Harvard Medical School. He then was an intern in pediatrics at MGH and did his residency in psychiatry at McLean Hospital. And he is currently a professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, as well as a psychiatrist at MGH. He has a very interesting CV. I'll just sort of highlight a few things. He's a former training director at the Massachusetts Mental Health Center and also was a training director at McLean. And currently, he's the director and founder of the program in Psychodynamics for the MGH McLean program. He's won a number of honors and prizes. Let me just mention a few. He won the Nancy Ruski MD Prize for contributions to medical student education and psychiatry from the APA, Excellence in Teaching Award at Harvard Longman Psychiatry, the Philip Eisenberg Teaching Award for MGH McLean, the Laughlin Distinguished Achievement Award from the American College of Psychoanalysts. He's had a number of funded projects. The one probably most relevant to today is the Adaptation to Aging, a project that was started by George Valiant, and then Bob collaborated with Dr. Valiant and then took over the project from him. Dr. Waldinger has 56 original research publications, 17 book chapters, and 3 books, but I just want to focus on 2 of the books. One is Psychiatry for Medical Students, which was a core text at one time used by over 1/3 of US medical schools. And it came out in 3 editions over 20 years. And the other book, which I think is the subject of today's talk, is called The Good Life: Lessons from the Longest Scientific Study of Happiness, published by Simon & Schuster this year, and it's already been published in 43 languages and is a New York Times bestseller. He gives a TED Talk on this, and it's called What Makes a Good Life? It's the 8th most viewed TED Talk in history, and this talk about it's a talk about the Harvard study of adult development and has been viewed over 100 million times. So we are honored today to have Bob be able to talk to us. Let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Robert Waldinger.
Wow, that was quite an introduction. Well, I'm delighted to be here, and particularly because for me, I get to catch up with some old friends. And thank you all for braving coming in person, and I know there are a bunch of people on Zoom. So let me jump in. I study adult lifespan development. Sometimes people say I study happiness, but really the much broader field of how do people go through their adult lives, both biologically and psychosocially. But studying happiness was not considered a legitimate endeavor, certainly scientifically, for most of the research. And then about 30 years ago, people began to unpack this assumption that most of us had, that if we were getting wealthier as a society, we were getting happier. Because when people actually looked and asked people how happy they were, as gross domestic product went up in Western societies, happiness either stayed the same or went down. And so people began to develop rigorous measures of happiness and realized that we needed to take this seriously. So now, let me see if I can, how do I do this? I can do it. There, yeah. So every year, the United Nations publishes the UN World Happiness Report, and you can download it, the most recent one. And that is the result of demographers, physicians, sociologists, psychologists going all over the world and asking people about their lives, and particularly asking people what they need in order to have a good life. What's interesting is that what people say is remarkably consistent across cultures, demographics, age groups. And that, yes, what they do say is that having their basic material needs met is important for happiness. And we know that people get happier until they reach a certain threshold of having food security and housing and healthcare and being able to educate their children. And so one estimate recently in the US was that if you make $75,000 a year on average household income, that's the kind of threshold beyond which you could make $75 million a year and you wouldn't get that much of a bump in your level of happiness. So what do people say they need beyond getting their material needs met? And again, these come up every year. Oh, this is a better one. Yeah. Okay. So they say they need social support, not a surprise. They need to be able to expect that they can live a healthy life, and that means access to decent health care. They need freedom to make big life choices, and that varies a lot depending on where we live in the world. An interesting report that comes up consistently is people say they need opportunities to be generous in order to feel like they're having a good life. Not just generous with money, but generous with expertise, generous with time and effort. And then finally, they need to be able to trust, both at the local level, they need to trust their neighbors, and they need to be able to trust their governments. So that's all well and good. These keep coming up year after year. And then when we ask young adults, what are you going to prioritize as you start out in your life? When we ask 20-somethings what their major life goals are, in 2017, there was a really good study that showed that over 80% of 20-somethings said that their main priority in life was to become wealthy. Not just to get their basic material needs met, but becoming rich was going to make them happy. And similarly, over half of young adults said that their major life goal was going to be to become famous, which, if you think about it, is an extraordinarily odd goal. And then finally, many of those same people said that a priority had to be to achieve a great deal at work. Now, those three things were not on, they're never on the list of what people tell you around the world that they need to feel that life is good and meaningful. So what's responsible for the disconnect? And that's what we're trying to figure out all the time as we do our work. So in fact, what we know is that the good life gets defined for us instead of by us. And in some ways, it's quite obvious. But if you think of all the messages that we get from our cultures every day about what will make us happy, they say that, if you buy this car, you're going to be happier. If you serve this brand of pasta, your family dinners are going to be blissful. If you buy this face cream, you're never going to look old. And on the one hand, we can all laugh because we know it's absurd. And yet these are the messages that we see all day, every day, everywhere we look. And social media has accelerated this. So I pulled this from Facebook. This is one of the photos that we post for each other all the time in our curated lives. If you were coming from outer space and you wanted to know about human life, you would, and all you saw was social media, you would imagine that we were always like at great parties or on beautiful beaches, and of course, again, this is absurd. We all know this. And yet, when we keep watching each other's curated lives in the media and on social media, it leaves us with the feeling that other people have it all figured out and that we don't. One of my teachers said this, and I find it so helpful, that we're always comparing our insides to other people's outsides. We're always comparing the me that, wakes up some mornings feeling good and with, but some mornings I wake up feeling lost or like my life is going nowhere, with these lives that look like everybody else has it figured out. The other thing, and we know this as psychiatrists, as mental health professionals, is that we're bombarded with images of what our bodies are supposed to be, what we're supposed to look like. So this is a typical underwear ad. And deliberately, I chose a male body because women's bodies are much more commonly exploited. But we are given these messages of what we're supposed to look like. You know, the ad agencies never show us this kind of ad, right? You know, again, it seems absurd as I speak about it, and yet think about how we are inundated with these images all day long. So this is my opening to make a case for why I do what I do, which is I study, well, what's life really like for real people as they go through their lives? That's what I've spent the last 20 years doing. Now, most of what we know research-wise about human life, we know from asking people to remember the past. And retrospection is a perfectly valid way to collect information about life, but we know that our memories are full of holes. We know our memories are creative. And so it's particularly important, but unique to follow people forward, to not ask them just to remember, but to see how the story is going to come out. The other thing we do often in trying to understand the course of things across the lifespan is we do snapshot approaches to research. So, you know, for example, if you wanted to do a study of depression across the life course, you could do a snapshot approach. You could look at depression in 20-year-olds and 40-year-olds and 60-year-olds, right? And you could, through that, try to draw trajectories of what is the life course, what is the natural history of depression. But the problem with that is that it promotes false connections. It can. The best way to explain this is through, there was a congressman, a senator from Florida, Claude Pepper, who once said, when I look at South Florida, I would have to conclude that you are born Cuban and you die Jewish. And that was his way of saying, you know, if you just take a snapshot and you think that's how life goes, you can go really wrong. And we have found that, you know, one of the things that you look in the research literature and you find that there are many false connections made through this kind of snapshot approach to looking at life course. So again, this is the reason why I'm telling you about what I do, which is the Harvard Study of Adult Development. It is, as far as we know, the longest in-depth study of the same people that's ever been done. Actually, I'm the fourth director. Tony mentioned I took over from the third director, George Valiant. This was a study that began in 1938 with two studies that didn't know about each other, both of them at Harvard. One at Harvard Student Health Service. 268 Harvard College sophomores, 19-year-olds, were chosen by their deans as fine, upstanding specimens. And it was meant to be a study of normal development from adolescence into young adulthood. You know, so of course, if you want to study normal adult development, you study all white guys from Harvard. It is the most politically incorrect sample you could possibly have. We're constantly explaining to NIH why they should still fund us. And then, in addition, at Harvard Law School, they started a study of juvenile delinquency where they looked at children from Boston's poorest neighborhoods, also in 1938, and not just children selected for poverty, but children selected because their families were known on average to 5 social service agencies in 1938 for domestic violence, for parental mental illness, physical illness. Over half of the families were immigrant families. Again, all white people, because the city of Boston in 1938 was 97.4% Caucasian. So since that time, what we have done is to make sure we collaborate and corroborate our findings with studies of more diverse samples. Because we have 724 families total that are all Caucasian. And that is the most significant limitation of our study, of which there are many limitations. We have achieved gender balance. We brought in all the partners of our original men, our original 724 men, and we brought in all their children, over 1,300 of them. Now they're baby boomers, more than half of whom are female. So when we started the study, we began with detailed physical examinations, psychological examinations, and social histories. We sent workers to their homes where they sat down with the family, talked to the parents and the grandparents, and looked at discipline style, made notes about what was being served for dinner during the visit. And all of these people were then followed over time. No one dreamed that I'd be standing here today telling you that we're still collecting data on these people. So the Harvard men were of an age where they were eligible to serve in World War II. So virtually all of them went to war. The inner city men were 9 years younger on average, and so they were not eligible for the war. But then all of them were followed through into midlife. You know, they all became doctors, factory workers, bricklayers. John F. Kennedy was part of the Harvard group. The Boston Strangler was part of the inner city group. Most people were at neither end of those extremes. They were just living their lives. And then gradually we studied aging and retirement in the first generation, and now in the second generation. Almost all the first generation have died. Only 30 of the 724 are still living, but we're still in contact with them. So what did we study? Well, it was the big domains of life: mental health, physical health for the Harvard men, World War II experiences, work lives, and relationships. Quite a bit about relationship functioning. And as I said, we took elaborate histories. We had them fill out questionnaires repeatedly. But then we've become a kind of history of science. As new methods for studying human well-being come online, we've adopted some of them. So we audio tape and videotape people. We watch them talking to their spouses, talking to their children. We bring them into our laboratory. We deliberately stress them out and watch how their cardiovascular systems recover from stress. We put some of them in the MRI scanner and watch their brains light up as we show them positively and negatively valenced images. We draw blood for DNA and now messenger RNA, studying DNA methylation, telomere length, variety of parameters of well-being. So what have we learned? Well, you know, hundreds of papers. This is like now our 11th book from the study. And one of the things that we found, one of the big core findings, won't surprise you. It's that if you take care of your health, it really matters. That literally the people who get exercise, don't smoke, don't abuse substances, eat well, get preventive health care, that all of that conveys years, not just of longevity, but of disability-free life. And so these are really powerful, robust findings. But again, other studies have found that. And then beginning in the 1990s, there were some findings that began to emerge that we at first didn't believe. When we started to look, because we had by then followed some of these people out into their 80s. And then the question was, what predicts, if we look back at them at midlife, what are the strongest predictors of who's going to be disability-free and happy and still alive in their 80s? And, you know, we looked at the usual suspects: blood pressure, cholesterol levels in midlife. But what we found was that the strongest predictor of healthy living and happiness was the quality of their connections with other people, that their satisfaction with and degree of connection to other human beings predicted health. And at first we didn't believe it. Like, it made sense to us that, okay, being more connected, you know, would make you happier, okay? But how could the warmth of your connections, how could that make it less likely that you would get coronary artery disease, type 2 diabetes, arthritis. Like, how could that possibly be? And then what we found was that other research groups began to find the same thing. And we began to understand that this is actually quite a robust finding across multiple studies, multiple groups. So then the question that we've been asking in our lab for the last 10 years, and many other labs are working on this, is how does it work? What are the mechanisms by which social connections get into the body and shape our physiology? And so what we know, for example, is that social disconnection is a strong risk factor for poor health. Loneliness is as powerful in one estimate as smoking half a pack of cigarettes a day over multiple years, as having untreated high blood pressure, as being obese. This comes from the work of Julianne Holt-Lundstad at the University of Utah. What we know from many studies is that intimacy conveys a longevity benefit. For men, married men live 7 to 17 years longer. Married women live 5 to 12 years longer. In every marital study, marriage is a better deal for men than women. It's just, it constantly emerges. The other thing we know from many studies now is that broader social networks and more social activity predict slower cognitive decline as we age and later onset of cognitive decline. Again, repeated in multiple studies. So that's the good news. The bad news, of course, is that loneliness is an epidemic. And we've been reading a lot about this now. Just most recently, the Gallup survey in February of this year asked people, just random sampling, how lonely do you feel lonely? How lonely did you feel yesterday? And 17% of adults, an estimated 44 million in the United States, said that they were lonely a lot of the day yesterday. In some studies, the prevalence is more like 1/3 to 40% of adults will tell you they are lonely much or all of the time. Loneliness is a subjective experience. It is that sense of not being as connected to other people as you want to be. It's different from being alone, right? And it's different from social isolation. People can be quite happy when they're isolated. They can be quite lonely in a marriage, in a crowd. Now, the other interesting thing is that the loneliest groups are adults under age 30. In fact, the loneliest groups around the world are age 16 to 24. Highest prevalence. Low-income households, people report more loneliness, 27%. So then the question is, how does this work? What might some of the mechanisms be? And here's where stress and stress reduction seems to be one of the most promising avenues in current research, that stress and loneliness are associated with heightened cardiovascular reactivity, with decreased immune function, with higher levels of chronic inflammation. One of the interesting studies in Janice Kikolt-Glazer's lab at Ohio State was wound healing. She did punch biopsies, typical, derm procedure, on a matched group of people caring for demented relatives and a matched group of people not caring for demented relatives. The caregivers took 9 days longer on average for these punch biopsies to heal than the ones not caring. And what we know is that being a caregiver is one of the most stressful activities, particularly for people with dementia. So one of the fun things about doing longitudinal studies is you get to ask the same questions over and over again. So we asked the same 6 questions about marriage. We asked them 8 times over 50 years. How satisfied are you with your partner? How much do you argue? And again, corroborated by other studies, we're happiest with our partners when we first get together. Marital satisfaction goes down when the first child is born, and it only goes back up again when the last child leaves home. And more recent studies have been finding that marital satisfaction only goes down again if kids return to live at home. This is true. And of course, this is culturally based, unlike most of what I'm presenting to you. You know, in many cultures, it's the norm to live at home until you get married, or even after marriage, right? So this happens to be a kind of US Western world specific study and set of studies that I'm talking about. Now, the other thing we know is that relationships don't have to be entirely smooth to convey the benefits that we're talking about. You know, if you think about it, no relationship of consequence is without conflict, without disagreements. We brought couples into our lab and had them have an argument with each other, and we videotaped them. And the setup was just argue about, you know, choose something you normally argue about. So it could be housework or childcare or time with friends or sex and the couples knew, you know, the video cameras were right there. They knew they were being videotaped, but they forgot about the video cameras really quickly and got right into it. And then we had raters systematically rate the videotapes, 30-second clips of videotape over and over again. And what we then did was follow up our couples 5 years later to see, well, who was still together and how happy were they? And it turned out that what we thought, that the degree of anger in the arguments would predict who was going to be unhappy, who was going to break up 5 years later, didn't predict it at all. It was whether our raters watching the videotapes could see affection and respect expressed even while the couple was having an argument. If people showed affection and respect for their partner, they were much more likely to be happy 5 years later and to be together 5 years later. So the other thing we learn, and not just from our lab, is that we get happier as we age. There's some good work from Laura Carstensen and her lab at Stanford, talking about what's called the positivity effect, where we get our moods get more positive as a species as we get older, starting in midlife. And what Laura's group and now our group has done is some experiments looking at, well, why is that? And it looks like when people begin to sense that time is limited, when they get much more of a feel for their own mortality, rather than getting more depressed, they get happier. Because what seems to happen is that we prioritize our well-being in a way we didn't before. And you can track this literally from midlife, from mid-40s on, where mortality salience goes up, people get more aware of mortality, and a sense of well-being goes up as well. So it turns out we pay more attention to what's positive in our world as we get older, rather than the usual negativity bias that we have as younger people. We even remember the past more positively. It turns out we whitewash our memories. And in fact, when you try to do a systematic interview of older adults about their childhood memories, you get like, everything was blissful. I mean, there's you know, and when you compare them to what they would say when they were younger, there is a kind of revisionist history. We get choosier about how we spend our time. So as we get older, what you notice is that people trim their contacts very systematically, and they trim them so that they just don't hang out with those people who they haven't really enjoyed in a long time. They stop going to those meetings that they really don't like anymore, that they trim those activities. They are less driven by the shoulds in life and pay more attention to what they want. And of course, they savor the present moment more. So I'm just going to give you one example of some of the experiments that can be done to understand how our appreciation of information changes. So this was not from our lab, it was from another lab in Laura Carstensen's group, but they did a study of how younger and older adults receive and process information. So they showed a group of adults this photo, and they said, this is going to be part of an advertisement for a new camera. And we want you to tell us which of these two taglines do you think will sell more cameras? And the two taglines were, capture the unexplored world, and capture those special moments. So as you can imagine, the younger people preferred which one? Unexplored world, absolutely. And the older people definitely by far capture those special moments. Then the same researchers took a separate group of older adults and said to them, imagine that you're going to live 20 years longer than you expect to, and you're going to be in really good health during those 20 years. And then they asked them the same question, choose among these taglines, which is going to sell more cameras? And those older adults were just like the younger adults. They all chose capture the unexplored world. And that's an example of how our sense of time horizon makes a difference in how we receive and process information and what significance we give to it. All right. So the other thing we study and other groups study is how we use our income. So we ask people about how they spend their discretionary income. And there's actually a group at University of Rochester who studies this. So do we spend our discretionary income on things or on experiences? And what makes us happier? If we say, buy tickets to a basketball game or to a museum or, take a family vacation, as opposed to buying a new flat screen TV or a new car, right? And it turns out, as you can guess, that the best things in life aren't things. That when we pay for experiences, that makes us happier, and it makes us stay happier for longer than when we pay for material objects. So then the question again is why? How does that work? Well, what we know is that material objects just beg for comparison. And there have been very good studies that show that the more often an individual compares themselves to other people during a given day, the less happy they are. So when you're buying a material object, I buy a new flat screen TV and I'm all excited about it. And then I go to my neighbor's house and she has a bigger one. And, it lowers our well-being. Whereas when we go on vacations, when we go to, to community events that we pay for, what we find is that it strengthens relationships. Most often we're doing that either with people we already know, or we come into contact with new people, or both. And it's the relational components of paying for experiences that seem to foster the most happiness. Okay, so I've told you about why relationships are so important, so powerful. This is the bad news. Bowling Alone you'll probably recognize that title. Robert Putnam is a political scientist at Harvard who wrote a book in the 80s called Bowling Alone, where he looked at what he calls social capital. How much are we investing in each other? How much do we join clubs? How much do we go to houses of worship, invite people over to our houses, eat together as families? And what he found was a dramatic drop starting in the 1950s in our investment in social capital. Then he did this survey again several years ago and found that, again, all these parameters got worse, that people were attending many fewer club meetings, families were not eating together as often. And one of the things you probably know is that family dinners, eating together regularly, are hugely impactful for child development, for family cohesion. Having friends over, again, a dramatic decline. The other thing he found was that when he surveyed people in the 1980s, about 12% of Americans said there was nobody they could talk to about personal matters. And then when he came back in the 2010s, he said 1 in 4 people in the United States, he estimates, have no one on the planet who they can confide in. So this is a significant drop. So what's responsible for this? Well, certainly technology has something to do with it. Technology did not start this decline at all, but it seems to have accelerated it, that these screens that we're so addicted to and enabled by and help us so much are also designed to capture our attention, hold it, keep it, take it away from other people. they also take our attention away from the natural world. This is what, I think this was in the New York Times. It's this iconic photo, and you see people, at restaurants where everybody is sitting together, but they're on their phones, and sometimes they're texting each other, but they're not looking at each other. They're not talking to each other. And so we know that the digital revolution has accelerated some of these processes of disconnection. The other thing is that we have now come to understand that loneliness at work is a very important factor in our lives. Think about it. Most of us spend most of our daily life, most of our waking life in the workplace. The Gallup organization did a survey of 15 million workers around the world. They've done it more than once. And one of their primary questions was, do you have a best friend at work? And what they mean by that question is there anybody at work you could talk to about your personal life? Only 30% of workers said they had a best friend at work. But when they also surveyed these workers, colleagues, their supervisors, they found that those who had a best friend at work, they were better at customer-facing activities. They produced higher quality work. They were less likely to get injured on the job. They were less likely to leave their jobs for what looked like a better opportunity because there were people they wanted to show up for every day at work. The people who had no best friend at work, meaning 70% of workers, when asked how engaged are you in your job, only 1 in 12 said that they were very engaged in their work. So this has huge impact. And the reason this is important, because even if you don't care about your workers' levels of happiness, you might care about the bottom line. And we know that, and lots of business schools now are doing research on this, that there's huge impact to the bottom line about whether people have these connections at work. The other thing they did is they studied people at all levels of organizations. Half of CEOs reported feeling lonely all or much of the time. So then the question is, well, what do we do about all this? And of course, there's a great deal of worry about this now in our culture. I'm going to turn to one of my Zen teachers for a quote that I find so helpful at times, John Tarrant. He wrote, "Attention is the most basic form of love." That if you think about it, our undivided attention is probably the most valuable thing we have to give to other people. It's also the most difficult thing. Some of you in the back are residents, right? And I teach a lot of the residents at MGH McLean. And when we talk about turning your eyes away from your screen while you're working with a patient, they are shocked. They don't know how to do that. They can't do that, right? So how do we give our undivided attention to each other? It's increasingly difficult to do. So there's lots of ways to do this, with long-standing relationships, date nights, in workplaces. There are ways to create workplace environments where human connection is facilitated, where vulnerability and asking for help and cooperation are all facilitated and rewarded. Family dinners. One of my colleagues, Anne Fischel at Mass General, does the Family Dinner Project, and she's amassed so much powerful research on the benefits of families eating together. And then finally, volunteering in the community. So I'm going to wind up here. My messages are really simple. They're that human connection turns out to be a major source of health, not just happiness, as human beings go through their lives. That technology certainly has the power to connect us, as the people on Zoom will tell you, but it also has tremendous power to isolate us. And that isolation is increasing, and that probably we need to be much more proactive in structuring life at home and in the workplace to combat what otherwise seems to be the path of least resistance, which is taking us away from each other toward increasing isolation. So that's where I will end. And so we've got time for questions and comments and complaints. Anything. Yeah. How do you want to do this? Tony, are you running around?
Looks like I used talk show. That's what I.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes.
Go ahead, hand up.
Geraldo? Was it? Oh, yes. Donahue. Okay, not Geraldo. He was more lowbrow.
So I come from Puerto Rico, so my culture is very connected. And when I come to the US, one thing that I noticed was that my patients, they did not have that. The family was not like that. The friends were not like that. And I'm like, there's a lack of connection. I'm wondering, and I think it has to do with the culture and how it's about working and I don't need anybody. I could do it by myself. What about if you guys have considered studying a culture that it's more connected, that it's ingrained in the culture, and see what are ways we can promote this, right?
Yeah, yeah. No, it's such an important point. There are studies doing this, and actually, there's a study that many people know about. There's a psychiatrist, Tony Earls, who was at Harvard for many years. I think he's retired now. But Tony did something called the Chicago Neighborhood Study, where he did studies of, it was 3 different neighborhoods in the city of Chicago: African American, Puerto Rican American, and I think Mexican American. And I think it was in the Puerto Rican American neighborhood where every mother knew every child's name in the neighborhood. And every mother was looking out for those kids and would discipline those kids, right? The Mexican neighborhood and the African American neighborhood did not function in the same way. They were not connected. They didn't know each other in the same way. The rates of child delinquency were so much lower in the neighborhood where every child had 1 million mothers, right? And they were so much lower. Children did better at school, right? So I think what Tony's work finds is that these neighborhoods where they're more family-centric, they're more community-centric, have tremendous benefits for child development and for general social functioning. But I suspect there are now better, this is more in the realm of sociology, and so often the work is you're gonna find that work probably more in sociological journals, but it's really powerful stuff. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So we were kind of whispering when you showed the engagement. Sorry, I know maybe a little rude, but that is such an important area that I know our department has struggled to improve and the medical group has struggled to improve because, interest in work has, engagement in work, really, not interest, but engagement in work has decreased during the pandemic. And I mean, I'd just be interested in your thoughts about it. It's very interesting to see that the dinners and being together improves engagement. And I'm not sure it's the same on Zoom, but I would be interested in your thoughts on the engagement or the lack thereof and the impact of Zoom and COVID and whatever.
Absolutely, because we've seen it at MGH. I mean, now much of our department is working remotely from home. And so you go, we used to walk through the hallways and we'd see each other, and you have these casual conversations, these like water cooler conversations they used to be called, right? And now the hallways are empty. Many of the offices are empty because people are only there 1 or 2 days a week. And it's been particularly hard for the residents, for our trainees, because many of the faculty aren't there where they can just, kind of knock on your door in the way that they used to be able to. And so I think like Vivek Murthy, who's our Surgeon General, is trying to specifically create opportunities. He even has a Zoom staff meeting at Health and Human Services where he's created a tradition where for the first 5 to 10 minutes, one staff person talks about something personal. It could be something challenging. It could be something just like I like to garden. It could be anything, but people love it. and people won't allow him to stop it because it turns out and then people have all these offline conversations because they learn about each other's personal lives and it fosters more connection. I don't know how, I think we're all struggling. How do we do this? How do we come together and have a feel of community in the way that we did before COVID? I mean, just like getting to come and see you guys, right? It's like, oh, this is so nice.
Bob,
Yeah.
I couldn't agree more. The strange thing is, even when we're here, everybody's having the meeting in Zoom from our individual offices. So you want to know the best thing that's happened to me since the pandemic? Last Friday, we had a fire drill and everyone was flushed out of their offices. I saw people out in the courtyard I hadn't seen in 3 years.
Yes.
And
That's what, because we're all in our offices, right? And even if we're not on Zoom meetings, we work one-on-one or work with families, but it's very isolating. Yeah. So first of all, have more fire drills. That's what you should do. But the question is, are there, and the difficulty is we're also pressed for time and we're all, there's so much demand for services, right? How do you create the spaces where people have lunch together, where they talk together, where they just schmooze? Is there any way to do that and feed people in the process like you're feeding people now? But because it really makes a difference. We know that. It's just that so many forces are mitigating against that, against creating those spaces and those, where we can be with each other.
So I just had a question about the slide where you were talking about the young people said that they wanted to be rich.
Yeah.
Can you go into a bit more detail about that? Because it strikes me that there is a real grounded perception that in order to have your basics covered, you now need to be rich, right? So it's hey, boomers, stop talking about the fact that you bought a house when you only, made X amount of money, but we can't do that. So I think can you describe more what led to them saying that they wanted to be rich rather than saying they wanted their needs to be covered?
Yes. So, and that's a really good point. And, the later generations, look at us boomers and say, you guys had it so easy and we can't expect to have the level of well-being that you have. So they drilled down into this. This was I think it was published in Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, this survey. And yes, some people said, I just want to pay off my loans. I want to be able to buy a house. That was different from the sizable group of people that said, I want to get rich. And many times when you would ask, what would the wealth be for? People couldn't answer. And that's where the cultural messaging comes in. I mean, think about how we glorify people who are billionaires. I mean, think about a very prominent person in our political life who probably got where he is in part because people thought, well, he must know what he's doing. He's so rich, right? And he's not alone. I mean, there are many people who we do that with. And so there are these kind of cultural myths. They're often around men, and they're often around men who consider themselves self-made, like there is such a thing, right? So I think you're right, but you're pointing out something really important, which is that is different from, I want to be able to buy a house. I want to be able to pay off my loans before I'm 80. Yeah. So, yeah.
First of all, thanks very much, Bob, for the talk. Talking about happiness, I mean, you can't go wrong. And I'm thinking I have to give a talk about aggression and violence this afternoon. I'm thinking, how can I do that in a happy way? Anyway, so you've been a training director, and probably I'm sure this has been asked, and I'm sure it's occurred to you. I don't know how to look at it. How do we think about the fact that we are training an entire generation of psychiatrists now that had a 2-year period where they didn't learn together, and then followed by a long period where we only occasionally get together? When I was asked about this, and we were discussing at one of the training directors meetings, I couldn't find any data that showed the parts of being an effective psychiatrist that come from the fact that you encountered one another in groups and learned together.
I know.
So how do we think about that? Because I actually am concerned that we are training an entire generation of people who will, maybe they'll be better, maybe not, but they'll be different than the model
Absolutely.
that we thought we were training them for.
Oh boy. Yeah. So last year I supervised, one of my supervisees was a PGY4 at the time, who, when we began supervision, she confessed to me, I've never seen an outpatient in person. And it was like, oh my gosh, okay, we're going to start from there. You know, what you're asking, Sheldon, is like, so we know that a great deal gets filtered through a digital medium, right? So, you know, I do psychotherapy on Zoom now. I do some of it in person, some of it on Zoom. If you had ever told me you could do meaningful psychotherapy on Zoom, I would have said you were crazy. Well, you can, and many of our colleagues are doing it. So that's a surprise. We know that things get filtered out, but I think what you're saying is you can't find papers yet. No one, I don't think there is the research yet, although I think it's underway, to look at what are the aspects of human interaction, and particularly nonverbal communication, that get filtered out through a digital medium that we pick up on often subliminally, not even consciously, when we're with someone in person. And so I think that we have yet to learn about what we're missing. We know we're missing things. I mean, remember what it was like to come back together again after we'd all been locked down, and there was this just upsurge of like positive feeling. It was like happiness, yeah, because we knew we'd been missing something. But there needs to be more rigorous scientific study of what it is that we miss when we aren't together in the real time. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk on a topic that's applicable to literally everybody. I'm a third-year psychiatry resident now, and I'm noticing just how many of my depressed patients in the outpatient clinic that are depressed have just a lack of social connection. Yeah. So how do I, as a psychiatrist, address that with patients, and what are some like practical ways that I can get them to be less lonely?
Yeah. Well, first, this is great. I mean, first of all, it's to ask about it. And in fact, there are some primary care protocols now where primary care docs are asking about loneliness, because what they find is that it's the driver of so many complaints that people bring to their doctors, certainly to their psychiatrists. And, and then to your question, what do you do about it? I mean, often we didn't ask about it because we were scared to hear the answers, right? And I think, the question, I think probably starting with people's communities, they have done some research on, okay, how do people make connections most easily? And what they find is that putting yourself in situations with the same people over and over again, and ideally around a shared endeavor, is more likely to foster new connections. Because if you're with the same people and let's say you're doing psychiatry together, or let's say you joined a gardening club, you have an immediate thing in common, an immediate conversation starter. And so one of the things to suggest to people is to ask people, what do you love to do? Or what do you really care about in the world that you might be able to do alongside other people? Because that is one of the ways that research shows that friendships can develop. It's not a panacea, and many people, as we know, are more introverted, and so the barriers, the reluctance to take those risks are greater for those people. There are actually CBT protocols that they've developed at the University of Chicago about how to stop giving off the signals that a lonely person often gives off. If I'm scared of you, don't come near me. But so there are a variety of measures, but that's like the first one that comes to mind. Yeah.
Thank you. That was a fabulous talk. I have long follow-ups for I'm a social psychologist.
Oh.
About the fact that so many of the things that you suggested that would be helpful to us, like eating family dinners together, are just difficult. I mean, I would just think this. Yeah, that would be great. Oh, good. My kids are moving out soon. My satisfaction is going to go up. Like that I can do. That's just how
that I can do.
things within the society that make this achievable. I'm really wondering if you have any thoughts about things that one can do via policy changes, public policy changes, that can actually help to kind of change the nature of their lives.
Yeah. Yeah. Whoa. Yeah. Oh, boy, if I knew, but I'm thinking, James Heckman won the Nobel Prize in economics. He's at the University of Chicago. He published a paper in Science. Economists don't publish in Science, but his paper was a huge meta-analysis of when we invest, for every dollar we invest in children, what is the payoff in adulthood in terms of self-sufficiency, not depending on the state, productivity. And what he found was that for every dollar you invest in children 0 to 4 and the people who care for them, you get the payoff is just astronomical, even compared to age 5 to 8, age 9 to 12, so the curve quickly tails off. So I think what I would say is, if we wanted to make the best investment, we would invest in young children and the people who care for them, right? And that would impact family dinners. How do we make it so that families could eat together? You're right. I mean, with parents working 2 and 3 jobs, how do you do that? Some of it is also education, like helping families know that, even if you could eat together once a week as a family, that matters. Because there are many, many families, as we know, who don't ever eat together. So anyway, but your question is right on target, and I don't know the answers.
We have a couple of questions online. Here's one of them. In the area of stress mechanisms, was there any comparison study regarding World War II and Vietnam PTSD victims, especially regarding moral injury?
Ooh. I don't know about moral injury, but actually what we did a study of who developed PTSD. Interestingly, the researchers, I don't know how they did this, but they assessed what we now know are the symptoms of PTSD. They assessed this in the 1946 questionnaire when people came back from the war. So flashbacks, nightmares, all those things that we now know are the criteria. And then we studied this and we found who developed PTSD and who didn't. And what we were able to see was that the people who had the warmest childhoods and the people who got along best with their fellow soldiers were much less likely to develop PTSD than the people who felt less connected to family and in childhood and then less connected to their fellow soldiers. So there was a protective effect of warm relationships.
Another question. George Valiant wrote quite a bit about defense mechanisms across the lifespan from earlier versions of this study. Has that data held up?
Yes. It's weird that it's held up. Like even I'm a psychoanalyst and I didn't believe it would hold up. It turns out those ratings of defenses, the adaptive coping mechanisms, if you will, right, in the modern parlance, they turn out to be such robust predictors of health, of all kinds of certainly success at work. We were surprised, as opposed to some of the tried and true psychology measures like the NEO, the 5-factor personality model, that doesn't really predict very much at all. So it turns out that assessing how people habitually cope with stress turns out to be a strong predictor of how they're going to fare both health-wise and interpersonally as they go through their lives.
Thank you. This was a wonderful talk. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And that's the book, I presume?
That's the book. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. This is a pleasure. Thank you.